Hi, welcome to War Christ. My name is Marcus. Today I'm joined once again by the wonderful Professor Nancy Pearcey. Professor Pearcey is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth and Total Truth. She's professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She's been quoted in the New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today, and hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. So, just if we may, Nancy, let's look at your fascinating recent book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, which is available for pre-order now on Amazon and at other sites. So, I suppose, what first of all moved you to write the book, and what do you hope readers will ultimately take away from it then?
Well, the original impulse was, of course, noticing how such extreme hostility has become common against men, even in respected media outlets. So the Washington Post had an article actually titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And I thought, this sounds like some feminist outlet. This doesn't sound like the Washington Post. The Huffington Post had an article where an editor said her New Year's resolution was to kill all men. And books have appeared with titles like Are Men Necessary? And No Good Men and The End of Men. You can buy T-shirts now that say so many men, so little ammunition. I mean, it's become, acceptable to use such extreme inflammatory language. And so that's, of course, what first caught my attention. And I would say, too, that sort of exhibit A of toxic masculinity tends to be Christian men. And so it was not hard for me to find examples of that as well. That the idea is that if Christian men hold any notion of headship, to use a theological term, in the home, that makes them oppressive, overbearing, tyrannical patriarchs. That silences women, disempowers them. It leads to abuse. So I found several quotes from both secular and Christian sources saying that any form of, well, let me just read you a few. I have my notes here. Conservative Protestant gender ideology can clearly lead to abuse, both physical and emotional. It's no secret that abuse is prevalent in conservative churches that embrace headship theory. The fear of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. And so, that kind of language catches your attention. Oh, and studies too. So there's a 2016 study in which 46% of American men said that these days society seems to punish men just for acting like men. And there was a more recent one in the UK. So this is not in my book because it just came out. It was done for International Women's Day. 55% of men in the UK, more than half, say that discrimination against men now is as bad as discrimination against women. So whether you agree or not, that's a lot of people who think that men are now getting a bad deal. That there's hostility toward men. Well, here, let me give you an anecdote. So I told my class, I teach at Houston Christian University. It was recently changed from Houston Baptist University. So I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, and immediately one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." So this was the problem that I wanted to address. And what was really stunning about it is that when I began to look at the sociological literature, it turns out that these accusations are ignoring the data from social science, that the social sciences show that, in fact, Christian men do very well compared to the average American man. Most of these are American studies, but probably the same thing across the Western world. The social study, the science, it's all hidden away in the academic literature. That's why people haven't heard about it. So that's what I did. I went looking into the academic literature by psychologists and sociologists. And what they found is that truly committed Christian men, in other words, the ones who really are authentic in their Christian commitment, who attend church regularly, test out as the most loving husbands. And by the way, they do survey the women separately, which is important. Mm-hmm. Psychologists know that if the woman is in the same room as her husband, she may not be honest. So they survey the women separately, and the women do report, they test out as the highest in saying that they feel happy with the love and affection that they get from their husbands. They test out as the most loving and engaged fathers, both in terms of shared activities like sports and church youth group, and in terms of discipline, like setting bedtime, setting limits on screen time. They also test out as having the lowest rates of divorce, lower than secular men. And they test out as having the lowest rates of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America, lower than secular men. So it turns out that the numbers are completely skewed. Once you actually get into the data, most of these charges are actually false. And not even Christian people know this, right? Not even Christians know this because it's not been widely publicized. Let me give you a quote on this too. So my go-to sociologist, the one who's done the largest study, is named Brad Wilcox, and he's at the University of Virginia. He founded the Institute for Family Studies there at UVA, and he has a whole book. He has a study that's so large that he wrote a whole book, not just an academic paper on it. And he got an article published in the New York Times, of all places. He is considered like perhaps the top marriage sociologist in the country. Mm-hmm. So he does get published in places like the New York Times and the Washington Post, even though he's a conservative Catholic. And listen to this quote. This was for Valentine's Day. And a progressive had written an article saying that progressive marriages are much happier. And so he wrote a response to that and got it published. Mm-hmm. And he said, yes, progressive marriages are happier than the average because they are more intentional about their marriages. So that's true. But then he said, but let me show you my evangelical couples. He said, it's a J curve. They're much higher. Yeah. And here's how he quoted, here's the actual quote. He said, in the New York Times, he says, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America, they often phrase it in terms of the wives, because, the assumption is that any form of headship is oppressive to wives, right? So they often state it in terms of which wives are happiest. The happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. The happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives with conservative gender values. So this is just so far contrary to what anyone thinks, even Christians, that this was really why I wanted to write the book. I said, this has to get out there. We need this information. We need to encourage Christians that they're actually doing quite well compared to the average, and to keep it up. Most of us do better when we're encouraged, not when we're blamed and shamed. So I wanted to get this information out there.
Oh man, thank you so much for doing so, Nancy. And I have read each one of your books on various topics on arts, science, and so on, and each one has been a revelation. So some of this data and the way you tie it all together is most helpful. So I'm grateful for that. And in your book, you also say that men are being torn between these competing scripts for masculinity. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about those, and maybe how does a genuine Christian masculinity differ from, say, that of an Andrew Tate, who's become something of a kind of sensation online, even though he's maybe genuinely toxic in some ways, and maybe the woke sort of folks on the other extreme, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, let me finish about what they found about Christian men, because we can't ignore the fact that some Christian men do fall short, and I wanted to kind of explain that as well. Mm-hmm. Because most people have heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of society, In fact, what I read was that's one of the most widely used statistics by Christian leaders today. And so when I talk to people, that's often one of the first things they push, the first pushback I often get, because everyone's heard that. And so the researchers went back to the data, and what they did is they separated out the committed, authentically convicted Christian men who attend church regularly from nominal Christian men. And when I told my students this, they didn't know what the word nominal meant. So let me define that. Technically, it means in name only, right? It comes from the Latin. Nom means name. So it means Christian in name only. Mm-hmm. And so these are men who often, I think perhaps America has more nominal Christian men than most places, because we've had, such a history of Christianity being dominant in our culture. But there are a lot of nominal Christian men who are Christian because, they will check off Baptist on a survey, for example, because of their family background and their cultural background. But they don't actually attend church, or rarely, if at all. And they do fit the stereotypes, and shockingly so. They have the least happy marriages. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They have the least amount of engagement with their children. They have the highest level of divorce, higher than secular men, and the highest level of domestic abuse and violence, higher than secular men. So this is really shocking, that people who are out there claiming the label of evangelical Christian men are actually doing much worse even than the secular world. So if you put the two groups together, obviously the statistic is going to be skewed, and that's what most surveys do. They just say, "Oh, you're an evangelical," and they put them in the same survey. In fact, the committed Christian men are far better than secular men, but the nominal Christian men are worse than secular men. So it's extremely important to understand the difference. That the sociological data is kind of clarifying where the numbers really fall, so that. And according to at least one study, they're about the same number. You and I probably hang out mostly with fairly committed Christian men. So I went into this thinking nominals were kind of a small group. Well, not in America, at least. No, it's about the same size. So if you meet somebody who identifies as an evangelical Christian man, you've got about a 50-50 chance that he's evangelical, really committed, or he's merely nominal. So it's an important distinction to help us understand really what's going on, and what the church is up against. The church is up against all men who say they're Christian but are clearly not. Nominal Christian men then are people who take the language, they hang around the fringes of the Christian church enough to pick up the language of headship and submission, but then they invest those terms with secular meanings from the secular guy code of dominance and entitlement and control and so on. So that's kind of what we're up against. And when we try to have a ministry, like if the church, for example, has a ministry to men, they have to realize that they've got men on both ends of the spectrum.
No, that's excellent. Thank you for that clarification, Nancy. And it's interesting that you say that even in line with who I mentioned, this man, Andrew Tate, because even when he did identify as a Christian, it was for very pragmatic concerns. If you ever listen to him speak, it was about how this is the tough religion and atheists are just weaklings and so on and so forth. And then he went on to become Muslim using the same rhetoric. He just switches based on who he thinks is kind of powerful in very worldly terms and so on. So
interesting.
Yeah. And
yeah.
You also say, sorry, Nancy.
Do you want to? I'm sorry, but do you want to pick up the two opposing scripts then again? That your earlier question.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah, this was really interesting because I found that I had to start my book with this. Even men today are attacking masculinity, which I thought was interesting. I found even men saying things like, well, you probably saw this. It was pretty recently. The director of Avatar, the movie Avatar. Did you see that where he said testosterone is a toxin?
Yeah.
And another famous person is Hugh Howey. He's a best-selling fiction writer. And he too said, testosterone is the problem. Women should be in charge of everything. And a book by a man said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. So it's coming not just from women, as you might more expect it, but men are also piling on. So as a result, what I found is that this is the most controversial book I've ever written, which I didn't exactly expect. I really thought Love Thy Body would be the most controversial because it deals with issues like homosexuality and transgenderism and so on. But in fact, this book on masculinity has been more controversial. I did a class on it in my at Houston Christian University. And when my students went home and told their parents or their spouse what they would, were reading a book on masculinity, the first question was always, whose side is she on? Whose side is she on? Like, is this some kind of a male bashing feminist, or is she some reactionary, defending men? And that's the response I got constantly was, you're either on one side or the other. And so I found this really interesting questionnaire done by a sociologist, and I put it right at the beginning of the book because it tends to disarm that knee-jerk reaction. So his name is Michael Kimmel, and he has written several books on masculinity. And what he did is he went around the world. He went around the world. He's fairly well known, so he speaks all around the world. And so he came up with 2 questions that he would ask young men, especially. And he said, he would say, what does it mean to be a good man? If somebody dies, you're at a funeral, and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man. What does that mean? And in fact, I'm going to read it to you. I want the exact words. Men had no trouble answering that question. They said, honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, stand up for the little guy. I kind of like that one. Stand up for the little guy. Be a provider, be a protector, be responsible, be generous. And the sociologist would ask them, where did you learn that? And the young man would say, well, it's everywhere. It's in the air we breathe. And certainly in the West, they would usually say it's our Judeo-Christian heritage. So then the sociologist asked them a follow-up question. He said, well, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? Oh, no, that's completely different. And they would say, and again, I'm going to read you their exact words. That means be tough, strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid. In other words, the real man is pretty much what we mean when people talk about toxic masculinity. They're talking about what young men are picking up as, be a real man. Those are the characteristics and traits that get associated with the phrase real man. And so in a sense, I was able to use that, the good man versus the real man through the rest of the book. Like, where do we get our ideals of the real man, which is like these men said, mostly our Judeo-Christian heritage. And how did the concept of the real man develop? Where did the concept develop that masculinity is toxic? So that's kind of what drove much of the book, is I just wanted to know, where did this come from? It didn't just come from the 60s and feminism. It came from much further back. And so we're much more able to deal with something effectively if we know where it came from and how it developed.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nancy. And you also show that men are falling behind actually in things like education, employment, health even, and life expectancy. It goes as far as that. Why are people ignoring those real problems that men face today then?
Yes, I think that's one of the ironies, isn't it? That there's so many hostile attacks on men. And in the meantime, men are actually falling behind on several measures. Education in particular, they're falling behind in education all the way from kindergarten up. Even in kindergarten, girls are more verbal. They'll sit quietly and talk, and they have fine motor control, so they can color and use the scissors. Mm-hmm. So all the way in kindergarten, boys start falling behind, all the way through elementary school, high school, college. Most universities, the average now in the university is 60% female, 40% male. In fact, some colleges like Harvard have actually quietly started instituting programs of affirmative action for men because they don't want to go beyond 60-40. Houston Christian University, where I am, when I first came here, it was 70-30, 70% female, 30% men, which is why they started a football team.
Mm-hmm.
They started a football team and they started an engineering program to attract more men.
Mm-hmm.
Also, more women than men are going to graduate school and even professional schools like law school and veterinary school. So at all levels, of education, men are falling behind, which is ironic because every university has a women's center designed to deconstruct male power. Well, meanwhile, men are dropping out and not doing so well educationally. And there's been an enormous amount of money poured into creating programs to advance women. And this is good. I'm not saying this is bad. Women were not even allowed in most universities until about the mid-20th century. So their success is just astonishing, and we should be praising them for that. But what it's done is it's blinded us to the fact that now men are actually falling behind, not just falling behind women, but falling behind where they were. Men are more, as you mentioned, they're more likely to be addicted to drugs or alcohol. They're more likely to commit suicide. They're more likely to perpetuate crime and be victims of crime, both. They're more likely to be in jail. I mean, 95% of all inmates are male. Men are, and then you mentioned life expectancy. Work. This was a surprise to me. Did you know that men now, male employment levels are at depression era levels? It's the same as the depression. And the reason we don't know this is because it's not showing up in our unemployment statistics because they've stopped looking for work. You don't get counted unless you go and, sign up at the employment office. So most of us don't realize that. Depression era levels. And then, as you mentioned, life expectancy. For the last 4 years or so, male life expectancy has gone down while women's has stayed the same. Science magazine actually said the biggest demographic for early death now is being male. So the reason, but why, you asked why aren't we doing more about this? It's because if you say we need to have programs for men, a lot of feminist groups say no. They really are very hostile to the notion of even starting programs that would be helpful for men. People like Summers, Christine Huff Summers has written about this because she's tried to get programs for men, and she's run into the opposition by feminist groups. And what they say is, well, wait a minute, men still end up in the upper echelons of power, presidents and CEOs and tech companies and Hollywood film directors and so on, which is true, but that's probably less than 10% of all men. On average, men are doing worse than they were in the past, and that's what we have to help people realize.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Nancy. And to your point there about these crude images people have of what power means and men occupying the most positions of or highest positions of power and so on, and ignoring all the contravening data and so on. I also wonder, how does a Christian perspective on what power actually is transcend that ultra focus on that type of worldly power, which seems to be more one-dimensional in the first place? Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree with you. But on the other hand, I wouldn't totally dismiss it because let's start with biology. Men are bigger, stronger, and faster. And there are some feminists who dispute that. They say, oh, if women just worked out more, they could be just as strong. No, I'm sorry. This is testosterone. This is biology. And in some ways, we do have to acknowledge that men have more power on that very basic biological level, because if we don't acknowledge it, we won't put moral restraints on it. I think it's very important to acknowledge that men have like 75 greater upper body strength, muscle mass. It's 75% greater muscle mass, 90% greater upper body strength. Oh, and this is a word I didn't know before. Men have more fast twitch muscles. That means they can react more quickly. And that's why Scripture is full of, Scripture does say women are the weaker vessel, First Peter. It doesn't mean weaker in character. It doesn't mean weaker in moral, moral sense. It doesn't mean weaker in intelligence. It's just realistically saying, yes, women in most cultures, starting with biology, women are weaker, and therefore we have to train men in a sense of responsibility. Otherwise we get what we have in the secular world today, which is increasing levels of abuse and so on. Men have to be aware that they have more power, and economic power as well. When women have babies, they are economically dependent on a man, on their husband, because it's very, very hard to raise children and have a full-time job, and support a family. You can't really do both and give them the kind of attention they need. And when women do put the kids in daycare or get their grandmother to come or whatever, someone is doing the mother's work. If the mother's working full time, it takes two people to raise children. And so women are economically dependent during that time. So that's a power issue as well. So I don't want to totally deny that men have more power. I think that's realistic, and that they have. If we don't acknowledge it, we won't put, like I said, we won't put moral restraints on it, and we won't make men feel responsible for how they use that power. There was the first ever cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity, not of men, but of concepts of masculinity. What does it mean to be a man? Mm-hmm. It was done a few years ago by an anthropologist, and he said every culture, no matter how different they are, expect of men what he calls the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate, meaning become a father, raise a family. Provide, protect, procreate. He said, no matter how different their understanding is of the male role, they all have the 3 Ps. And so I think we need to help men to realize that, yes, you are stronger physically. You do have more economic power, in most cultures, more social power. And you see, it's kind of hidden to us today because feminism does have a lot of power in the West. But I have a friend who does economic development. He has an organization that does economic development. It's called Discipling the Nations. It's from Jesus. When Jesus said, go and disciple the nations. So it's called Discipling the Nations. And he said, we have no idea how badly women are treated in most countries. Here in the West, we have no idea how badly most women are treated in most cultures. So I think we have to realize that, if men do not have the moral constraints that the West has traditionally had because of Christianity, they will often abuse their power. And that's why I don't want to totally deny that men have more power. They do. It's how they use it. Do they use it in a biblical way?
Amen. Thank you, Nancy. And another facet of your work generally, and this book too, is you look at the long history of ideas and so on, and the impact of technologies and these very multifarious analysis, which is most appreciated, because I see a lot of my friends will react to what they see in the popular culture, but they'll not know that these ideas have trickled down from academia and so on and so forth. And I think that's most important because it gives us a more holistic picture of what's actually happening. And that's something I appreciate about your work. So with that in mind, I wonder if you might say something about where the idea of toxic masculinity came from before it came up to our TV screens or iPhones and so on.
Yeah, that was really one of the main questions I was trying to answer in this book, because it starts a lot further back than most people realize. I had to go back to the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, men worked side by side with their wives and children on family farms and in family industries. And so that really tempered their character, because they had to be kind and gentle, as you do have to be with children. They were training their children in the adult skills, working alongside them day in and day out. And so the cultural expectation for masculinity was very much a caretaking role. You didn't work for yourself, you worked for your family. They actually the Puritans took verses from the New Testament against selfish ambition. And they actually thought ambition was a bad thing because that was, pushing yourself forward. No, you work for your family. And of course, men also had the more traditional masculine virtues like courage and resilience because they were making their way in a wilderness. So there were always new fields to plow, a new town to build, a new business to start. So they also had the more traditional roles, but even those, they were not thought as personal ambition or pushing yourself forward. It was you were taking care of your family. In fact, a common phrase back then was that you're not only the father of your family, but you're father of the community. You bring that fatherly ethos into the way you treat your surrounding community as well. How did we lose that? We began to lose it with the Industrial Revolution because when work was taken out of the home, of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and industries and businesses and offices. And for the first time in American history, men were not working alongside people they loved and had a moral bond with, their wives and children. For the first time, they were working as an individual in competition with other men. Well, how do you think that would affect their character? Already we begin to see in the literature of the time, we begin to see people complaining that men were becoming assertive and aggressive and egotistical and acquisitive and greedy, looking out for number one, because it seemed that in the industrial workplace, that's what you had to do to get ahead. And they were working as individuals. And so they became much more individualistic in their outlook. In fact, when they came home at night, they had to kind of deprogram themselves because you can't be that way with your family. Mm-hmm. And so you see already in the 19th century, you see literature complaining that men's character was changing. You begin to see negative characterizations of the male character. Now, in my book, Toxic War and Masculinity, I do show several more stages. That was just the first stage, but that really set the tone. That's what we have to understand. And you can ask me about some of the other stages, but that's how far back we have to go to begin to find language describing men in negative terms. They didn't use the word toxic yet, but they did have some very negative characterizations saying that, that men were no longer carrying out that sort of loving, caretaking role that was expected of them in the colonial era.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And I'm also curious how, as society grows more secular, how does secularization contribute to this negative script for masculinity then?
I was going to talk about that next. That was next on my list. So it wasn't just the economic situation, though that was important, but it was also that American society was secularizing. By the way, I do limit the discussion primarily to America just because it had to fit in a book. But you will see similar things, across the West. I mean, Britain, the Industrial Revolution came to Britain first. Mm-hmm. It was imported in a sense from Britain. So a lot of these same characteristics you'll see there. But as the Industrial Revolution proceeded, there began to be a very large public sphere. That wasn't the case before. When businesses were home industries, that it's centered in the home. Now that there's these large factories, there becomes a large public sphere of business, industry, banks, academia, government, and so on. And people began to say that this public sphere should be secular. It should be run by purely scientific principles, by which they meant primarily value-free. Value-free. Values get in the way of doing what's maybe most economically, profitable. And so men were the first to become secularized. They became secularized before women did because they were working on the public square. They were getting a public education, a secularized education. And so people began to say, oh, well, if the public sphere is value-free, where do we protect values? People didn't want to just lose values like love, altruism, kindness, religious devotion, unselfishness, and so on. And they said, well, values have to be cultivated then in the private realm. If they're kicked out of the public realm, they have to be cultivated in the private realm. And who would be responsible for them? well, women would be, because women were the ones in the private realm. And so for the first time in history, the first time in human history, women were said to be morally superior to men. We have the double standard today. And so again, we tend to think this goes back forever. No, it starts in the 19th century. That was the first time that the double standard arose, all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. Virtue was thought to be a masculine trait. You know, the insight into right and wrong was seen as a rational insight, and men were thought to be more irrational, and therefore men were more virtuous. Do you know what the Latin root of the word virtue is? VIR?
Like virile,
man.
masculine, yeah.
I mean, it's man, right? It's like virile. So virtue had overtones of masculine strength and honor. And so it was really in the 19th century for the first time that women were said to be more virtuous, you know, and men were being sort of let off the hook because they were being expected to function in the secularized public square. They were no longer expected to be virtuous. They were expected to come home at night and to be reformed and refined by their morally superior wives. And so this is the origin of the double standard. And although eventually, of course, that doesn't work, but that is where we still have a bit even today. I think we have some notion that, I asked my students, in the dating sphere, is that still the case? And they're like, yeah, definitely. The woman's supposed to draw the line on a sexual involvement, for example. And I think the feminist movement is very much predicated on the idea that women are more virtuous and have a right to tell men how to act. So I think we still have that, but it did lead to a secularization of the male character, which was your original question. If men were working in the secular realm, they did become less committed to Christian moral principles and moral standards, and no wonder this behavior began to be worse. In the 19th century, there was a great increase in drinking, gambling, gang activity, fighting, smoking, prostitution. The sort of traditionally male vices grew enormously in the 19th century. Partly this was young men, by the way. Young men were coming in from the villages, finding work in the big cities. And they were away then from the traditional structures of accountability, like family, church, village, and so on. And so they even fell prey, even more so than adult men. I'll give you one fact to sort of hang this on. Sometimes one fact helps. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today. So there was a reason that there was a huge mushrooming of reform movements in the 19th century, starting with the temperance movement. Public drunkenness became a real problem in the cities. So the temperance movement, there were movements against gambling, against prostitution. There was the abolition movement, of course, against slavery. But even these movements, these reform movements also tended to feed into the negative characterization of the male character, because these were mostly male vices. One historian that I quote puts it this way: there was little doubt as to the sex of the slaveholders, the tavern keepers, the drunkards and seducers. And so the antagonism between men and women grew during that time. The reform movements were also responsible for a lot of the negative rhetoric about the male character. So historically, these are really important stepping stones. In the 19th century, some of the literature was just as hostile. I wonder if I could find that quote. I had one quote I was going to give you. I don't know if I can find it fast enough. There was the language, though, that was describing men was very much like it is today. That Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was one of the early feminists, had a very strong quote where she said, men are, warmongers and hard-headed and amoral and violent, et cetera, and they need the tempering of women's morality and spirituality. And she called it the evangel of womanhood. Evangel means gospel. So she was saying, women are the ones who bring the gospel to men. So a lot of the language that we hear today, I mean, it was already equally extreme, even in the 19th century.
Mm. Thank you so much for that, Nancy. And I wanted to ask you about one figure, a living figure who's not an Orthodox Christian, but who is an interesting kind of lightning rod because he's attracted so much. Um, he's been reviled, he's been revered equally, depending on who you ask. Just that's Jordan Peterson. He seems, in some ways, to be filling a hole for people and even helping some to come to Christ, which I've experienced myself. Like, all of my friends have come to Christ through his work. I wonder what, and actually, I must say too, despite these kind of the way he's portrayed in popular media, you'd be surprised how many people are secret fans, so to speak, of him. Like my wife, my wife
Secret.
has like different friends. She's from Zimbabwe, and a lot of her friends will be African and so on. But there's this kind of myth that he's for white males and all this nonsense. But whenever his name's mentioned in our conversation, they'll say, "Oh, actually, I love him, and he's got really good advice for young couples, but he espouses the value of marriage and so on." I just wonder what you think of him, and maybe some of the main reasons for the continued appeal of figures like Jordan, and how can they maybe help us Christians, and on the flip side, what are some of the limitations of his work that we may critique and so on? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. So, like I said, the reform movement of the 19th century often had very, very negative language toward men, very critical. And eventually a reaction set in. Men were tired of being painted as the villain. And the people began to worry about a new word entered the American vocabulary, over-civilized. And what they meant was our boys are being raised by women, by mothers and female teachers, and they're losing their masculinity. They're becoming soft and effeminate. And so a counter movement grew up on how can we toughen up our men? And I would say we kind of are in the same, that same divide continues today. In other words, today we still have some notion that that men have been over civilized, that modern culture demasculize, is that a word? Demasculizes men, that it undercuts their sense of confidence as men, and the same two sides of the coin, which is that some men feel like that modern culture is still very negative and hostile towards masculinity, and that men are expected to leave their masculinity at the door, and we also have this contrary movement of men trying to recover their masculinity. And that would be Andrew Tate that you mentioned earlier, and Jordan Peterson. And so, like you said, we've got both extremes. And here's my concern. My concern is that both of them come out of the secular. The fact that the concepts of masculinity have been secularized, and so we no longer have a Christian understanding, and so we get these two opposite extremes. Let me give you another historical stage, and that was Darwinism. Darwinism in the late 19th century had a huge impact on concepts of masculinity. We usually just think he's a biologist, but actually he wrote a lot about how inferior women were. By the way, women are intellectually inferior. He was quite certain of that. And he even acknowledged that women have more sensitivity and intuition, but he said, but those are characteristics of the lower races. So even the things he said women were good at were, made them inferior. And then the person who was the main popularizer of Darwin here in America was a British sociologist, Herbert Spencer. He actually had more impact here in America. And he actually spoke very explicitly about how in the struggle for existence, the men who win out are going to be the ones who are the most dominant, the most domineering, the most tough, the most aggressive, even predatory. And so these are our ancestors, and these are the men who went out today, who gave us, our modern form of masculinity. And you ask, well, how did women manage to get along with such brutal men? Mm-hmm. And he said, well, women had to develop the ability to please. These are direct quotes, by the way. The ability to please. Mm-hmm. And it would also help if they learned to hide their resentment at being treated so poorly. So that was the impact of Darwinism. But it had a huge impact because there was an actual literary genre called literary naturalism that was inspired by Darwinism. And so here in the States, that would be Jack London. He's the best known. Jack London wrote about dogs, but he really intended to give a message about humans, that humans are products of natural selection, environment and genes, and that there's no higher, no spiritual, no moral realm, that would just essentially evolved organisms. And Theodore Dreiser, there's a whole host of literary characters who influence, and I should actually say perhaps the most popular level was Tarzan. Mm-hmm. Tarzan, I don't know if you know this, but there's about 50 books on Tarzan. It's a huge series. One of my sons read them all. But he did. His son actually comments on this. He says that the books were intended to show that we're products of, that were descended from the animals, and that we are beasts at heart, that we're under the thin veneer of civilization, what was a common phrase at the time. That he's overcome that problem of over civilization, right? He's remained tough and strong because he was raised by the beasts. Mm-hmm. And so even after he learns European languages and customs, he says to Jane at the end of the book, "I am still a wild beast at heart." He still prefers to dress in a loincloth and eat raw meat that he has killed himself. Mm-hmm. And they were immensely popular because men at the time were trying to say, how do we recover our manhood, our masculinity? So I think that from the 19th century, we've had sort of this tug of war between this pressure on them to give up the masculinity, but the opposing pressure, meaning, to be tough, to be truly masculine, you have to be tough and wild. And this also came out in not just the literary naturalists, but there was also quite a movement in literature towards exalting the cowboy. The Western was a new genre, and it celebrated the man who had escaped from civilization, who had left wife and family behind, and had discovered his true self out under the stars, with a bow and arrow shooting the animals and living with the cowboys, or being a mountaineer, a mountain man, or an explorer, or an Indian scout, or whatever. There was quite a large literature, late 19th century, early 20th century. And the best known being Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway. He actually has a book called Men Without Women. All of his characters are men who go out into the wild, or go into war, or go out into nature, because that's the only way they can recover their true masculinity, is by leaving civilization behind. So I would say that's a very secular view of masculinity, because I don't think that we're supposed to have to escape our family responsibilities in order to find our true nature. In my book, I take my readers back again and again to Genesis 1 and to the cultural mandate. The cultural mandate in Genesis 1 is be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And be fruitful, and the very streamlined language of Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply, it means not only start families, but all the other social institutions that historically grow out of the family, right? So, the clan, the tribe, the village, the nation, eventually, and the laws and treaties and constitutions that govern them. So the whole social institutions. Subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So that means not only plant crops, but build bridges and buildings, and make computers, and compose music. One of my students said, "When you compose music, how is that dominion over the earth?" I said, "Well, I play the violin." I play the violin. So I said, "Well, do you know what a violin's made out of?" Wood. What the bow is made out of? Horsehair. I said, so all the transcendent beauty that we associate with music starts with the raw materials of nature. And so I come back again and again to men will find their true sense of purpose and meaning by picking up the masculine, the masculinity from Genesis 1, investing deeply into civilization. cultural mandate means our original goal was to build cultures, build civilizations, make history. And of course, also God created man and woman in his own image. And so marriage and civilization are not things you need to escape from to find your true masculinity. In fact, you find it by embedding yourself deeply in your family and in doing creative work that benefits your society. So I think that a lot of the historically, a lot of the emphasis on masculinity has been a kind of escape. And we need to work against that and say, no, being embedded in your family, being deeply committed to your wife and children and to your work, doing useful, helpful work for your society is how you find your true self.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Nancy. And what you said there about the kind of positive uses of some of these technologies, I think is most important, because there does seem to be this tendency, a kind of reactionary tendency to escape to this past that never was in some places. And it seems to me from my reading of the scripture that clearly, like, eschatologically, it's the new heaven and the new earth. The new Jerusalem is a garden city to accentuate that what's going to take place is going to be a mixture of the original creation and humans' contribution, to your point, with music and arts and all those wonderful things, it seems. So I think that's most welcome point. And actually, I think it has a very practical application that I want to ask you about. In broad strokes, then, building upon what you described about the Industrial Revolution, for example, how have more recent revolutions like that of the sexual revolution of the 60s and the invention of things like which of course included things like the pill, and the invention of the internet even impacted society as it pertains to men and women? And you can either take that as its own question, or if you want to say something alongside that of how Christians might make those supplement to, or the staple of what it means to be proper embodied communities and so on, rather than making them a kind of simulacra that we live our lives through and so on. Does that make sense?
Yes, except that I'm going to take it in a more positive direction again, because we do want to find out a good way to use technology and so on. I do have a chapter on, I have two chapters on fatherhood, because obviously the most important long-term solution to toxic behavior in men is better fathers. Fathers raising their boys in healthy biblical ways. And so I have a chapter on what happened to fathers. Why is it that fathers today are mocked and ridiculed in the media, in cartoons and comics? And the father's always the butt of the joke. Right? The mother's always smarter. And even the kids are smarter, like the Berenstain Bear books, which another one of my there's about 50 of those too. and one of my second son read all of those.
Wow.
But I mean, it was very obvious that the father was the doofus, the dimwit, the one who always did things wrong. And even the kids, would laugh at him and make fun of him. Okay, so why did that happen? How can we bring respect back to fathers? I mean, obviously, if fathers are ridiculed and mocked, fathers are not going to invest in fatherhood. And today, what is the number? I think it's 42% of children are growing up, at least in America, without their fathers, without their natural fathers. It's the highest level of single parenthood in the world. America has the highest rate of single parenthood in the entire world. So fathers are obviously disengaged. How can we bring them back? How can where did it even come from? Why are they ridiculed? It all starts with the Industrial Revolution again. When fathers were working side by side with their children and the wives, they were deeply implicated in their family relationships. What happens after the Industrial Revolution? They're working outside the home all day. They come home and they're not familiar with what's been going on. They don't know what's happening with their kids. They're no longer intimately connected with their kids' thoughts and feelings, with their kids' needs. And already in the 19th century, you begin to see people complaining that fathers are no longer engaged. Fathers are becoming, you actually start seeing people say they're irrelevant. What are fathers for? There was a 19th century novel where one of the children characters that said, I can't figure out why God made fathers.
Wow.
And there were also people like there were during the reform movements, there were people saying, how can we get fathers home more? Fathers had become a Sunday institution. That was a phrase used at the time, meaning we don't see them all week. We see them on Sundays, and that's about it. Now, that's not enough to really be engaged with their families. And do you know, even some laws like the blue laws, the Sunday closings, that was not done for religious reasons. That was done to get fathers home. Shorter work days, so that fathers wouldn't have to work so long and could be home with their families. A lot of the laws that were passed at the time were to try to get fathers back home more so they wouldn't have to work so long. Even the family wage, which was a big thing back then. So if they made more money, they wouldn't have to work such long hours, and they could have more time with their family. So people were already working, being very concerned about that. And so I do have a chapter then on how can fathers get more involved with their children today, given that you can't reverse the Industrial Revolution. What can we do? Well, it's mostly anecdotal, but I have a whole chapter on men who have found ways to be more involved with their families, have found ways to have more flexible hours at work, or even have home-based work, home-based industries, consulting businesses, and so on, or take 2 days a week at home, working from home. New York Times just had an article. It's not in my book because it just came out. The New York Times has an article, and it was actually titled something like, during the pandemic, many men got closer to their kids, and they don't want to lose that. The New York Times says that? That's great. Fathers don't want to lose that. They like being more involved with their kids. They like the fact that their kids were home more, they were home more. There was another article, which is in my book. They found that 65% of fathers said that they would like to be home more. Once the pandemic is over, they've been working more from home. They don't want to go back full time because they do appreciate having more time with their families. And at this point, like I said, it's mostly anecdotal. You just, because there's no general principle here. But one of my graduate students, for example, her husband was an IT worker in Southern California, and he worked at home during the pandemic. And as a result, he was more involved with the homeschooling. He was more able to drive the kids to sports practice. He was, the time he used to work, he started cooking lunches. That became his thing. I'll cook lunches. And during the time that he used to take to commute to work, he and his wife now spend praying every morning. And he took up so much of the slack that his wife was able to start a part-time voice studio. She's an opera singer. One of my students was an opera singer. So she started a voice studio. And so the whole family's benefiting from the added income. And they say, I interviewed the husband, and he said, I am never going back to a cubicle. Our whole family has benefited so much from a better balance in our life. So I do have a lot of anecdotes like that in one of my chapters to try to encourage men that, we don't have to take the Industrial Revolution, the world is created, for granted, as though we just can't change it. Younger people are even more into surveys done of millennials. Most of them want more balance. Most of them, the husband wants more time with his kids, and the wife wants more time with work. I mean, men and women were both given both commands in Genesis to be fruitful, and to fill the earth and to have dominion. So it's perfectly proper for women to want to use their gifts in work. And it's perfectly proper for men to want to be more involved with children, and which we always had before the Industrial Revolution. So we're in an anomalous situation in terms of the whole scope of human history. We have to see if we can get back to the norm. Can we get back to a norm where there's a better balance for both men and women?
Oh, that's beautiful. And I hope your book can help us in that regard, Nancy, God willing. And I'm sure it'll help me, and I most appreciate it. Thank you so much again for writing it and taking that effort. And I want to say then, to conclude for this evening, is where can viewers or listeners find out more about you and about the new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, that we're speaking about?
Yes, well, all the normal book outlets like Amazon and christianbook.com and so on. And I am updating my website, though you can see the old one still, nancypearcey.com. If it's still there, so you can look and see my other books and so on. But we're going to have a snazzy new one in a little while. But yeah, the website and then the normal book outlets.
That's exciting. Thank you so much for your time, Nancy, and God bless you.
Oh, thank you. It's always a delight talking with you, Marcus.
I'm going there. Don't you want to go too? I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. I'm